Douglas pulled his horse to a stop at the edge of the ghost town. You're up. The July sun hammered down on bleached wood and cracked adobe. No sound reached him except the wind rattling through broken shutters. 20 years of abandonment showed in every sagging porch and shattered window. He dismounted slowly, his fine boots raising dust clouds with each step. The main street stretched before him like an accusation. He'd made this pilgrimage every month for 2 decades, same route through the empty buildings, same ritual of remembering what his greed had destroyed. The central well stood in the town square, its stone rim carved with names. Douglas knelt beside it, running his fingers over letters etched by families who'd once drawn life from these depths. The Millers, the Hendersons, the Whitcombs. He peered into darkness, bone dry, just like the other 11 wells scattered through the settlement. The water rights he'd purchased had choked this place to death, as surely as if he'd strangled it. With his own hands. Douglas pulled his ledger from his saddlebag. 20 years of tracking, documenting, remembering. Every family that had lived here before his scheme scattered them across the frontier. Names, last known locations, children born and lost. His own personal catalog of sins. Rebecca Whitcomb, deceased 1867. He read aloud to the empty square. Margaret Whitcomb, whereabouts unknown. A child's voice echoed in his memory. Why do we have to leave? He couldn't remember which family, which child. The question had haunted him through 2 decades of wealth that bought everything except peace. He'd tried compensation once. Hired investigators to locate the scattered families. But what could he say? Sorry I destroyed your life. Here's money. The thought made him sick. Douglas placed 3 gold coins on the well's rim, meaningless offering to ghosts who didn't want his gold. He pocketed them again. Ashamed of the gesture, the church stood at the far end of the square, its bell tower empty and silent. He remembered the day the bell had been removed, sold for scrap by the last residents too desperate to care about sentiment. Ain't she? That sound dying had marked the settlement's death. He had properties in San Francisco now. Investments in 3 territories, more money than he could spend in 5 lifetimes. None of it warmed the cold space inside his chest. 20 years of profit, he said to the empty street. 20 years of this, which was the real waste. Movement caught his eye. A dust cloud on the horizon. Growing larger. Douglas stood slowly, hand shading his eyes against the glare. A wagon approached from the east road. His heart hammered against his ribs. No one came here anymore. The ghost town existed on no current maps. Remembered only by those who'd been forced to forget it. Someone from his past had found him. Douglas watched the wagon draw closer. Unable to move. Unable to run. 20 years of monthly penance had prepared him for judgment. Now, it was coming to meet him. The wagon rolled to a stop 20 feet from where Douglas stood. A woman climbed down with practiced ease, her simple dress dusty from travel. Ralbo Haigumayend. She was perhaps 40, with steel-gray eyes that surveyed the ghost town without flinching. "Mr. Douglas," she said. Not a question. "Ma'am." His throat felt dry as the well beside him. "I'm Elizabeth Whitcomb. My family lived here before you bought the water rights." The name hit him like a physical blow. Rebecca Whitcomb. Deceased. Margaret Whitcomb. Whereabouts unknown. He'd read those words from his ledger not 5 minutes ago. Mrs. Whitcomb. It's Miss now. Widow these past 5 years. She moved past him to the well, running her hand over the carved names. My mother's handiwork. She insisted every family mark this stone before the water was blessed. Douglas said nothing. What could he say? Elizabeth pulled rolled papers from her wagon, spreading them across the well's rim. Architectural drawings. Detailed and professional. Plans for restored buildings. Well systems. A church with its bell tower rebuilt. I'm not here for revenge, Mr. Douglas. Her voice stayed level, almost gentle. I'm here to rebuild what was lost, and you're going to help me. He stared at the drawings, then at her face. You can't possibly... You know this town better than anyone alive. You studied every deed, every water claim, every legal weakness. She met his eyes without anger. Now I need that knowledge to restore what you destroyed. The irony wasn't lost on him. Use the tools of destruction for rebuilding. I'm the last man who should touch this place. ID Sakorstei. You're the only man who can... Elizabeth's finger traced the well system on her plans. You owe these families a debt. Mr. Douglas, I'm offering you the only chance you'll ever have to pay it. His mind raced through refusals, excuses, legal reasons why this was impossible. None of them reached his lips. My daughter grew up here. Elizabeth continued quietly. She was 7 when your scheme forced us out. She deserved better than watching everything die. And she rolled the plans carefully. So did all the children who called this home. Douglas felt the weight of 20 years pressing down. Even if I wanted to help, they'd never forgive. That's not for you to decide. Elizabeth walked back to her wagon, then turned. I'll be at the hotel in town. You have 3 days to choose whether you want to die wealthy and haunted, or die redeemed. She handed him the architectural plans. Their fingers touched briefly on the rolled paper. Miss Whitcomb. 3 days, Mr. Douglas. Then I start with or without you. She climbed onto the wagon seat. But we both know you won't run. Guilt prepared you for this moment 20 years ago. The wagon rolled away, leaving him alone with blueprints of hope and a ledger full of names. Douglas looked down at the plans in his hands, then at his ledger lying open beside the dry well. Elizabeth's vision of restoration next to his catalog of destruction, the same families on both pages. 3 days to decide. He already knew his answer. Douglas couldn't leave the ghost town. He walked through empty houses as twilight deepened, Elizabeth's plans clutched in one hand, his ledger in the other. The Hendersons had lived in the house on the corner. He remembered John Henderson begging him to reconsider, to give them more time. Douglas had quoted water law, cited precedents, remained unmoved. The house stood empty now, shutters hanging crooked. A child's toy lay half buried in windswept dirt near the porch. Chine. He moved to the next building, then the next, each one a family, each one a choice he'd made to value profit over people. By lamplight in what had been the general store, Douglas spread Elizabeth's architectural drawings on the counter. Why hoard fry? Detailed sketches showed not just buildings but a community, wells with proper pumping systems, houses with gardens, the church rebuilt, bell tower restored. She'd thought of everything. He opened his ledger beside the plans. The Whitcomb entry stared up at him. Rebecca, deceased 1867. Margaret, whereabouts unknown. Elizabeth had been Margaret, the 7-year-old asking why they had to leave. Now she'd returned with grace instead of vengeance. The weight of it crushed his chest. Douglas had told himself for 20 years that business was business, that legal maneuvering wasn't the same as stealing, that the families would find new homes, new lives, new wells. Lies. All lies he'd built to sleep at night. He thought of his father, whose approval he'd craved and never received. You're too soft for this world. Boy, money respects strength, not sentiment. Douglas had set out to prove him wrong by becoming exactly what his father valued. The wealth had come. The approval never did. Now here he stood in the ruins of his ambition, holding a widow's vision of restoration. Douglas walked to the church as midnight approached. The building sagged but still stood, stronger than the houses. The empty bell tower gaped like a missing tooth. Elizabeth's plans showed the bell recovered from storage in Santa Fe, waiting to ring again. He sat on the church steps, watching stars wheel overhead. Somewhere out there, families he'd scattered were living diminished lives. Some had prospered despite him. Others, like Rebecca Whitcomb, had died in the poverty his greed created. "I can't undo it," he said to the darkness. "I can't bring them back." But he could try to make something grow where he'd created death. Dawn painted the eastern sky pink and gold as Douglas mounted his horse. He rode toward town with Elizabeth's plans rolled carefully in his saddlebag. In Maisarhad, the hotel sat on the edge of the newer settlement that had grown 5 miles from the ghost town. Douglas found Elizabeth at breakfast in the small dining room. She looked up as he approached, her expression unreadable. "I'll help," Douglas said, without sitting. "But you need to understand something. The families won't forgive me. I don't expect them to." Elizabeth set down her coffee cup. "That's not for you to decide. Mr. Douglas, forgiveness belongs to the wronged, not the guilty. And then why? Because my mother carved those names into the well rim believing in community. Because my daughter deserves to know that good places can be restored." She stood, meeting his eyes. "Me. Because maybe if you can change, there's hope for all of us." Douglas felt something crack inside his chest. Not quite hope. Not yet. But perhaps the beginning of it. Where do we start?" he asked. "The wells." Elizabeth pulled on her riding gloves. "We restore life first. Everything else follows." They rode toward the ghost town together, the summer sun rising behind them, 2 figures against the vast sky, heading toward ruins that might become home again. The first week passed in a blur of surveying and planning. Douglas hired engineers from Santa Fe, workers from surrounding towns. Elizabeth directed every detail with quiet authority. The central well first," she instructed the chief engineer. "It fed the whole settlement. Once it flows, the others will follow." Douglas watched her sketch modifications to the water system, explaining pressure and flow with easy competence. "You studied this," he said. "My husband was a surveyor. I learned—" She didn't look up from her drawing. "After he died. I kept his books. Seemed wasteful to let knowledge die with him." They worked side by side in the brutal July heat. Douglas's expensive clothes became dust-covered and sweat-stained. His hands, soft from years of signing contracts, blistered from handling rope and timber. Elizabeth never commented on his discomfort. She simply handed him water during breaks and returned to work. The 3rd week brought their first test. A man rode into the settlement at midday, dismounting with the careful movements of someone carrying anger. "That's Frank Henderson," Elizabeth said quietly. "John's son." Douglas remembered John Henderson begging for mercy 20 years ago. The memory tasted like ash. Frank walked straight to Douglas. "Heard you were here. Didn't believe it. Mr. Henderson." And Douglas kept his hands at his sides. "I know what I did to your family." "You know, pie." Frank's laugh held no humor. "You know my father died 5 years after we left. Still trying to get back on his feet. You know we scattered across 3 territories because there was nothing left to hold us together." "I know." Douglas met his eyes. "I tracked all of you. It doesn't change what I did." Frank studied him for a long moment. The workers had stopped, watching the confrontation. "Why are you here?" Frank finally asked. "To try to make it right." "Can't be made right. Can't bring my father back." No. Douglas felt Elizabeth's presence beside him, but didn't look away from Frank. I can only try to make sure this place lives again. So maybe your children won't have to know what you lost. Frank's jaw worked. You think building houses earns forgiveness? No. I think it's the only thing I can do that matters. The silence stretched. Finally, Frank turned to Elizabeth. Miss Whitcomb, your mother was kind to us. I remember she spoke well of your family. Elizabeth said gently. Frank looked back at the settlement, at the workers waiting, at the dry well they'd been excavating. If this is real, if the wells flow again, I'll consider bringing my family back. He met Douglas's eyes. Not for you. For what this place was before you killed it. That's all I can ask, Douglas said. Frank rode out without another word. The workers returned to labor, the moment passing, but not forgotten. Douglas stood frozen until Elizabeth's hand touched his arm. That was well done. He hates me. He has reason to. Her voice held no judgment. But he didn't ride away. That counts for something. 2 days later. The central well struck water. The moment felt miraculous. Clear, cold water rising from depths that had been dust for 20 years. The engineer whooped. Workers gathered around, laughing. Douglas stood back, watching from the church steps. He couldn't celebrate. Didn't deserve to. Elizabeth found him there as the sun set. 1 down, 11 to go. Is this enough? The question escaped before he could stop it. Can water erase what I did? Nothing erases it. She sat beside him on the steps. But maybe you're not supposed to erase it. Maybe you're supposed to carry it and build anyway. Her hand found his in the gathering darkness. Brief touch. Quickly withdrawn. But the warmth lingered. Come on, Elizabeth said. Standing, the workers are celebrating. You should be there. Oh, they don't want me there. Probably not, but you're part of this now. Whether they want you or not. And Douglas followed her to the campfire. The workers made space grudgingly, but they made space. He sat in firelight, listening to stories and laughter, feeling more alone than he had in the empty town, but also, for the first time in 20 years, part of something larger than his guilt. Summer deepened into August. 3 wells flowed. 2 houses stood framed and waiting for walls. The ghost town began to remember what it had been. Douglas and Elizabeth fell into rhythm. Dawn brought shared coffee and planning. Days brought side-by-side labor. Evenings brought exhaustion and quiet conversations as stars emerged. Tell me about your husband, Douglas said one evening. They sat on the church foundation, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and purple. Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. Thomas was good, patient. He saw the world in lines and measurements, found beauty and precision. She smiled slightly. He would have loved this project. Rebuilding what was lost. How long were you married? 15 years. He died suddenly. Heart gave out while surveying a railroad route. Her voice stayed steady. Our daughter Margaret had just married. Moved to St. Louis with her husband. Thomas never met his grandchildren. Douglas heard the grief beneath her calm. I'm sorry. Life takes what it takes. Elizabeth turned to him. What about you never married? No. The admission felt shameful somehow. I told myself there wasn't time. Business required full attention. That's not why. Her directness startled him. No, he admitted. I suppose not. Why then? Douglas looked at his blistered hands, dirt under the nails that 20 years of fine living had kept clean. Because I didn't deserve it. Family, home, love. I destroyed too many families to build my own. That's pride talking, Elizabeth said quietly. Thinking you're so terrible you're beyond grace. Isn't it just honesty? It's self-pity dressed as nobility. She stood, brushing dust from her skirt. Grace doesn't wait for deserving. Mr. Douglas. It just shows up and changes everything. The next day brought the first completed house, the Henderson place. Rebuilt exactly as it had stood 20 years before. Douglas watched workers nail the final shingles, feeling the weight of irony. We should wire Frank. Elizabeth said, let him know his family home is ready. He may not come. Then we offer it to someone who will. That evening, they sat on the completed porch. Elizabeth had brought wildflowers, placed them in a jar on the windowsill. The small gesture transformed the empty house into something like home. My father never approved of me, Douglas said suddenly. The words came without planning. Nothing I did was enough. Not good grades, not business success, not wealth. Elizabeth listened without interrupting. I bought these water rights to prove him wrong. To show I could be ruthless, successful, the kind of man he respected. Douglas laughed bitterly. He died the year after I destroyed this place. Never said he was proud. Never said anything. So you kept going. Building wealth you didn't want. Proving yourself to a ghost. Yes. And now, Douglas looked at the settlement taking shape around them. Now I don't know what I'm proving. Or to whom. Maybe you're not proving anything. Elizabeth's hand covered his on the porch railing. Maybe you're just being human, making mistakes, trying to fix them. Her touch sent warmth through him. He turned his hand to hold hers, uncertain, half expecting her to pull away. She didn't. They sat in silence as darkness fell, hands clasped, neither speaking the thing growing between them. The next week brought two more families. The Mitchells and the Coopers, former residents drawn by news of flowing wells and restored houses. They arrived with children and belongings, eyes wary but hopeful. Douglas stayed in the background, letting Elizabeth welcome them. But he saw their glances, heard the whispered conversations. That's him, the one who... Why is he even here? Guilt, I suppose. Or maybe trying to buy forgiveness. But Elizabeth hosted a community meal the night the families moved in. Simple food. Tables set up between houses. Douglas helped carry benches, set up serving tables, then retreated to the church steps. She found him there. You should eat with us. They don't want me there. You're allowed to feel good about this. You know, about what we're building. Douglas watched children run between houses, heard mothers calling them to dinner. I'm allowed to try earning what I don't deserve. Feeling good comes later. Maybe never. Elizabeth sat beside him. You're a stubborn man, Douglas, and the use of his first name, without title, struck him as intimate. I've been called worse. I imagine you have. She leaned against his shoulder, barely touching. But I've seen you work, seen you face Frank Henderson, seen you take judgment without defending yourself. She paused. There's something decent in you, buried deep. But there. Or maybe just guilt looking for escape. Maybe both. Elizabeth stood, offered her hand. Come eat. You've earned a meal.
I'll go stay.
He let her pull him to his feet, into the circle of lamplight and community, where he belonged and didn't belong, where redemption seemed possible and impossibly far away. Jacob Miller arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September.
You changed numbers.
Douglas saw him riding in and felt his stomach drop. He recognized the man from his ledger, Sarah Miller. Wife, deceased 1869. Elizabeth stood beside Douglas in the town square. "That's Jacob," she said quietly. "He lost everything." Jacob dismounted slowly. Movements careful with age or pain or both. He looked around the settlement at flowing wells, rebuilt houses, children playing, and his face hardened. "So it's true." Jacob's voice carried across the square. Workers stopped. Families emerged from houses. Douglas the Destroyer playing at redemption. Douglas stepped forward. "Mr. Miller." "Don't." Jacob raised a hand. "Don't speak to me like we're civilized men having conversation. You want to know what you did to me?" The gathered crowd went silent. "My wife Sarah died in poverty because of you." Jacob's voice shook, but held steady. "We moved to Colorado, worked claims that barely fed us. She got sick that first winter. No money for doctors. She died asking if we'd ever go home." Douglas felt each word like a blow. "Mr. Miller, my children scattered after she died. I haven't seen my daughter in 15 years. My sons blame me for not fighting you, for giving up the settlement without a battle." Jacob moved closer. "You think building houses erases my wife's grave? You're building on ghosts. Douglas, on graves and broken families and lives that ended because you wanted profit." Elizabeth started to speak. Douglas touched her arm, stopping her. "He's right. You're damn right I'm right." Jacob's eyes blazed. "You want forgiveness? You want these people to pat your back and say you've made amends? You haven't? You can't. Sarah's gone. 20 years of suffering is gone. You can't rebuild that." "I know." Douglas's voice barely rose above a whisper. "I can't bring her back. I can't undo 20 years. I can only try to make sure this place lives again. It's not enough. It'll never be enough." The admission seemed to deflate Jacob's rage. He stood there, breathing hard, tears cutting tracks through dust on his weathered face. "Why are you doing this?" Jacob asked finally. "Because it's all I can do." "That's not an answer." Douglas looked at the settlement, at Elizabeth, at the watching families. "I did. Because Miss Whitcomb offered me a chance to try making something right. Because maybe if I spend the rest of my life building, instead of destroying, it'll count for something when I die. Not redemption. Not forgiveness. Just something that matters. It. Jacob studied him for a long moment. "You don't deserve mercy." "No, sir." "You don't deserve to be part of this community." "No, sir." "But my grandchildren deserve a home." Jacob's voice cracked. Sarah would have wanted that. She loved this place, loved the people. Even at the end, she talked about the settlement like it was paradise lost. He turned to Elizabeth. "Is this real? Will it last?" "If people choose to stay, yes." Elizabeth stepped forward. The wells flow. The houses stand. The land remembers what it was. Jacob looked at Douglas again. I'll watch you. If you falter, if this is some scheme, I'll make sure everyone knows. I understand. Don't mistake this for acceptance. My wife is still dead because of you. I know. Sir. Jacob walked to his horse, mounted slowly. He paused before riding out. My grandchildren live in Missouri. I'll write them. Tell them there's a place here if they want it. He looked at Douglas. Not for you, for Sarah's memory. He rode away without another word. The crowd dispersed slowly. Conversations quiet and troubled. Douglas stood frozen in the square until Elizabeth's hand found his. Come on. She led him to the church foundation where they'd shared so many evening conversations. Douglas sat heavily, head in his hands. Miller's right. What am I doing? Playing at redemption. Like it's a construction project. His voice broke. I can't fix what I broke. No, you can't. Elizabeth sat beside him. Sarah Miller is gone. 20 years of suffering can't be undone. You're right about that. Then what's the point? The point is Jacob's grandchildren might grow up here. The point is, Frank Henderson is considering bringing his family home. The point is this place didn't stay dead. She turned his face toward hers. You can't erase your sins. Douglas. But you can refuse to let them be the final word. How do you not hate me? The question emerged raw and desperate. Your mother died because of what I did. Your daughter grew up without the home she deserved. How can you even look at me? Because I chose to... Boy, Elizabeth's eyes held his. I could have spent 20 years hating you. I spent 5 years hating myself after Thomas died. Wondering what I could have done. Different. Hate doesn't resurrect the dead. It just makes more graves. She stood, pulling him up with her. So yes, Jacob Miller is right. You don't deserve forgiveness. You probably never will. But you're here, doing the work anyway. That counts for something. The autumn wind picked up, scattering leaves across the half-finished settlement. Douglas looked at the church foundation. The restored wells. The houses waiting for families. I don't know if I can keep doing this. He said quietly, You can... Elizabeth's hand stayed firm in his. Because the alternative is running. And you've run from your guilt for 20 years. It hasn't helped. What if it's not enough? Then it's not enough. You do it anyway. They stood together in the fading light. Destroyer and restorer. Watching the settlement that was and wasn't home, building something neither of them could name, Douglas packed his saddlebags by lamplight. 3 months of work, and Jacob Miller's words had shown him the truth. His presence poisoned the restoration. Better to fund the project and disappear. Elizabeth could finish without him. He wrote a letter explaining his decision, enclosed bank drafts covering the remaining construction, laid it on the church foundation where she'd find it. Dawn was breaking as he led his horse from the stable. Elizabeth stood blocking his path. You're running. Not a question. I'm doing what's right. My presence here taints everything. The family see me and remember loss. Better if you run away when it gets hard. Elizabeth's voice cut sharp as winter wind. Just like you ran 20 years ago, when you had to face what you'd done. You moved to the next city, the next deal, the next distraction. They saw, this is different. It's exactly the same. She moved closer. You think I'm offering you redemption? Douglas, I'm not. I'm offering you the chance to earn it. That means staying when people hate you. That means facing Jacob Miller every day. That means living with the fact that some people will never forgive you. I don't know how to do that. The admission broke from him. Neither did I when Thomas died. Neither did these families when you destroyed their homes. Elizabeth's eyes blazed in the early light. Hey, we learned. You can too. What if I can't? What if I keep trying and it's never enough? Then it's never enough and you try. Anyway. She grabbed his arm. You want to know why I really asked you to help? Douglas waited. I needed to see if the man who destroyed this place had any humanity left. I needed to know if greed was all you were. Her voice softened slightly. Leistes, because if you could change, if you could face what you'd done and try to make it right despite knowing you'd never be fully forgiven, then maybe there's hope for all of us. Maybe we're not trapped by our worst moments. The words struck him like physical blows. You used me for hope. I gave you the chance to become someone different. Don't waste it running. Douglas looked at his packed bags. The letter waiting on the church foundation. The settlement taking shape behind Elizabeth. 20 years he'd run from this guilt. It had followed him everywhere. If I stay, nothing changes. Jacob still hates me. Frank Henderson still sees me as the man who killed his father's dreams. I'll always be the man who destroyed this place and then helped rebuild it. Elizabeth interrupted. Both things. Always both. You don't get to erase the first by doing the second. Like, then why try? Because it's right. She stepped closer. Not because it earns forgiveness. Not because it makes people love you. Because rebuilding is better than destroying. Even when no one thanks you for it. Douglas felt something crack inside him. Not hope yet, but perhaps surrender to the harder path. Mom, you're asking me to spend the rest of my life being hated. I'm asking you to spend it doing what matters regardless. Elizabeth's hand found his. Frank Henderson is bringing his family home next month. The Coopers are expecting a baby in spring. Jacob's grandchildren might come. You helped make that possible. Stay and see it through. And us. The question escaped before he could stop it. What are we doing here? Building something. And all. She didn't look away. I don't know what. But I know running ends it before we find out. Douglas looked at the sunrise painting the settlement gold and pink. At the church waiting for its bell. At Elizabeth's face, fierce and certain in the morning light, he unpacked his bags slowly, retrieved the letter from the foundation and tore it in half. I'll stay, he said quietly, even when they hate me, even when it feels pointless. I'll stay. Elizabeth's smile broke like dawn. Good. Because we're hanging the church bell today. I need your help. The bell had arrived from Santa Fe the previous week. Recovered from storage. Cleaned. Restored. Now it waited in the church to reclaim its tower. Workers gathered to help with the lifting. Frank Henderson arrived with his family wife, 3 children, skeptical eyes watching Douglas. Mr. Henderson. Douglas approached carefully. Frank nodded shortly. Douglas, your father would be glad to see this. My father would be alive if not for you. Frank's voice held no anger, just fact. But my children will grow up here. That counts for something. They work together in careful silence. Ropes and pulleys. Men coordinating weight and balance. The bell rose slowly toward the tower, Elizabeth directed from below. calling adjustments. Douglas pulled rope until his hands bled, welcoming the pain as penance. When the bell settled into place, the workers cheered. Frank's children jumped and clapped. Elizabeth looked up at Douglas in the tower, smiled. "Ring it," she called. Douglas hesitated. That should be someone else. Someone who deserves. "Ring the bell." "Douglas." Elizabeth's voice carried authority and grace. "You've earned that much." He pulled the rope. The bell's voice rang out across the settlement for the first time in 20 years, clear and strong. It called to empty spaces and rebuilt homes, to scattered families and uncertain futures. Frank Henderson covered his ears against the sound, but Douglas saw tears on the man's face. "My father loved that bell," Frank said when it stopped ringing. Said it reminded him God noticed even small places. "I'm glad it's home," Douglas said. Frank looked at him for a long moment. "You're not forgiven. You need to know that." "I do. But my children call this home now. That changes things." Frank extended his hand. "For them. Not for you." Douglas shook it. The gesture formal and fragile. "That's more than I deserve." "It is," Frank agreed, and walked away to his family. Elizabeth climbed to the tower, stood beside Douglas as the sun climbed higher. "You stayed. You didn't give me much choice." "I gave you every choice. You made the right one." Below them, the settlement spread out in autumn colors. Houses standing, wells flowing, families building lives in a place Douglas had killed. "I still don't know if this is redemption," he said. "Maybe it's just grace." Elizabeth leaned against him. "Maybe that's enough." December came cold and clear, the settlement no longer a ghost town prepared for Christmas. 12 wells flowed. 20 houses stood complete. The school building opened in November, children filling it with noise and learning. Frank Henderson served as informal mayor. Jacob Miller's grandchildren had arrived from Missouri in late October. 3 kids and their widowed mother. Finding home in their grandmother's memory, Douglas had spent his fortune on the restoration. The San Francisco properties sold. The territorial investments liquidated. Everything poured into wells and lumber and futures he'd never share. He lived in a small house near the church, accepted but not embraced by the community. Children waved to him uncertainly. Adults nodded in passing. No one invited him to meals. Elizabeth had become the settlement's heart. She organized school fundraisers, helped families settle disputes, taught the younger women her late husband's surveying techniques. She took meals with Douglas most evenings, but they'd never spoken of the thing growing between them. Christmas Eve arrived with light snow. The church filled with families, old residents who'd returned, new settlers drawn by news of restored wells, children who'd never known the ghost town years. Candles lit every windowsill. The church glowed warm against winter darkness. Douglas stood in back, watching families gather, feeling the weight of not quite belonging. Elizabeth found him there. "You should sit up front." "I don't think I do." She took his arm. "Come on, ici seat." They sat together in the 3rd row. Frank Henderson read from Scripture. A young woman sang carols. Children fidgeted and whispered. Then Frank stood at the pulpit and looked directly at Douglas. "We have someone here tonight who wants to speak. I'll let him tell you why." Elizabeth squeezed Douglas's hand. "Go on." He rose on shaking legs. The walk to the pulpit felt endless. Every eye watched him. Some curious, some hard. Jacob Miller sat with arms crossed, face unreadable. Douglas gripped the pulpit to steady himself. 20 years ago, I destroyed this place through greed. His voice barely carried. He forced it stronger. I bought water rights knowing it would kill the settlement. I watched families beg for mercy and I turned away. I scattered you across the frontier. I created the ghost town that stood here for 2 decades. The silence felt crushing. Miss Whitcomb came back and asked me to help rebuild. I didn't deserve that chance. I don't deserve your forgiveness. Most of you will never give it. And you're right not to. Douglas saw Jacob's jaw tighten. Frank's children watching wide-eyed. But I've spent these months learning something. Legacy isn't what you take. It's what you give back. I can't restore the years I stole. I can't bring back those who died in poverty because of my greed. Sarah Miller will never see her grandchildren grow up here. John Henderson never saw his family home rebuilt. His voice cracked, but he pushed on. But I can give you this, a settlement that lives again. Wells that flow, homes that shelter. A church where your children can grow. That's all I have. It's not enough, it'll never be enough, but it's yours. Douglas looked at Elizabeth, drew strength from her steady gaze. I don't ask forgiveness. I ask only that you let this place thrive, build lives here that my greed once destroyed. That's the only redemption I'll ever know, seeing life where I created death. He stepped down from the pulpit, started to return to his seat, stopped. Jacob Miller stood slowly. The church held its breath. You're right. Douglas. Jacob's voice carried clear and cold. You don't deserve forgiveness. Douglas nodded, waiting for condemnation. But my grandchildren deserve a home. Jacob's eyes swept the room. My Sarah loved this place. She died talking about it, asking if we'd ever return. She never saw it restored. That breaks my heart every day. He looked at Douglas directly. But her great-grandchildren will grow up here. They'll drink from wells that flow clean. They'll walk streets their ancestors walked, because you helped make that possible. Jacob's voice softened slightly. So I'll stay. Not for you. For Sarah's memory. For the grandchildren she never met. For the life this place can give them. He sat down heavily. Frank Henderson stood next. My father died bitter and broken. That's your doing. Douglas. I won't forget that. Douglas braced for judgment. But my children call this place home now. They've never known what it was before. To them it's just where they live, where their friends are, where they feel safe. Frank's voice roughened. My father would have wanted that for them. So I stay. For them. For what this place can be. One by one. Others stood, shared their pieces of grief and grudging acceptance. The weight of it crushed and lifted Douglas simultaneously. Finally, Elizabeth rose. She walked to the pulpit. Stood beside Douglas. I asked this man to help rebuild because I needed to see if people can change. If grace isn't wasted. She looked at the gathered families. He's proven they can. Not perfectly. Not in ways that erase the past. But enough. She turned to Douglas. Ring the bell. Call us to celebration. Together, they climbed to the tower. Douglas's hands on the rope. Elizabeth's covering them. They pulled as one. The bell's voice rang out across the settlement, across restored homes and flowing wells, across lives being rebuilt, and futures taking shape. Below, families began to sing, children's voices rising clear and sweet. Elizabeth leaned against Douglas in the tower, both of them shaking. Merry Christmas, she whispered. I don't deserve this. No, she agreed. But grace doesn't wait for deserving. They stood together as the settlement celebrated its resurrection. Two figures in the bell tower watching life bloom where death had reigned. Waradi was dying. Spring came early to the settlement. March brought warm rains that turned the desert green. Douglas walked the main street at dawn, marveling at the transformation. Every house occupied. A school full of children. Wells flowing clear. Gardens planted behind homes. Shoots of new growth pushing through soil. 3 months since Christmas. 3 months since his confession. 3 months of being accepted without quite belonging. He'd spent his fortune. The bank accounts emptied into lumber and labor. His fine clothes traded for work shirts and calloused hands. The wealth that had defined him for 20 years reduced to a small house and enough savings to eat. Dichai. But the ghost town had become Grace Springs. The name proposed by Frank Henderson's youngest daughter, approved by unanimous vote. New signs went up last week. Douglas found Elizabeth in her garden, planting tomatoes. She'd taken the house next to his, never commenting on the proximity. "Morning," she said without looking up. "Morning." He knelt beside her, helping firm soil around seedlings. "The Harpers arrived yesterday. That makes 34 families. More than before your scheme killed it." Elizabeth brushed dirt from her hands. "We're becoming something new, not what was, but something else." They worked in comfortable silence. Months of shared labor had built ease between them, but the unspoken thing lingered. "Elizabeth," Douglas said finally, "I've given you nothing but a debt repaid. You deserve better than a man whose best years were spent destroying what you loved." "Is this a proposal?" She looked at him with gentle amusement. "It's an apology for not making one. You should have some. I should decide what I deserve." She stood, brushing off her skirt. "Walk with me." They moved through the settlement, past the school where children's voices rose in recitation, past the church where the bell would ring noon soon, past houses where families built lives and restored hope. "You gave me something better than money." "Douglas." Elizabeth stopped at the central well, its stone rim still carved with names. "You gave me proof that people can change, that grace isn't wasted. That redemption is real work, not pretty words." She traced her mother's name on the stone. "When I came back, I didn't know if you'd help. Didn't know if you had humanity left under all that guilt. Did I?" The question came quiet. "Yes." She turned to him. Buried deep. But there, under 20 years of self-punishment, there was still a man who could choose right over comfort. Who could face hatred and stay anyway? Who could spend his fortune rebuilding what he destroyed? Douglas felt his throat tighten. "I'm not—" "Marry me." Elizabeth's words cut through his protest. "Let's build a future, not just repair a past." The proposal stunned him silent. "I'm asking because I choose to, not because you've earned it or deserve it." She took his hands. Because I've seen who you are when everything else is stripped away. I've seen you choose the harder path. I've seen you stay when running would have been easier. The community will accept it or not. I don't much care." Elizabeth smiled. "I spent 5 years grieving Thomas. Longer than that, grieving the settlement. I'm done living in grief. I'm choosing life. I'm choosing you." Douglas pulled her close, years of careful distance dissolving. "I don't deserve you." "I know." She kissed him. "But grace gives more than we destroy sometimes. If we let it." The wedding happened 2 weeks later. Simple ceremony in the church. Frank Henderson stood as witness. Grudging, but present. Jacob Miller attended, face impassive but not hostile. The whole settlement came, some warmly, some dutifully, all watching as Douglas and Elizabeth spoke vows before the community that half forgave them. "I give you my life." Douglas said, "Such as it is, such as you've helped make it." "I give you grace," Elizabeth answered, "and ask you help me build home." They sealed it with a kiss as the church bell rang. Children cheered. Frank's wife dabbed her eyes. Even Jacob nodded slightly, acknowledging something passing understanding. Afterward, the celebrations spilled into the square. Tables set up, food shared, music played on fiddles and guitars. Douglas and Elizabeth stood at the central well as the sun set, watching their community celebrate around them. Spring rain began, gentle and life-giving. "I spent 20 years haunted by what I destroyed," Douglas said quietly. "I'll spend the rest of my life grateful for what grace restored." Elizabeth leaned against him. "Sometimes redemption requires rebuilding everything you broke, but sometimes grace gives you more than you destroyed." She kissed him as rain fell softly, washing everything clean. Children played between houses. Families laughed and talked. Wells flowed clear. The church bell rang evening call. Grace Springs thrived. Douglas looked at Elizabeth, at the settlement blooming around them, at the life growing where death had reigned for 20 years, legacy redefined. Past acknowledged but not defining, future opening like spring flowers after long winter. "Is this redemption?" he asked. "It's better." Elizabeth smiled. "It's grace, and it's home." The rain continued, gentle as blessing, washing dust from new growth, filling wells that had run dry, giving life to a place that remembered both dying and resurrection. In the bell tower, the recovered bell caught rain on its bronze surface. Come morning it would ring again, calling the settlement to another day of building what had been broken, loving what had been lost, becoming what grace made possible. Douglas held Elizabeth as darkness fell and lamps lit in windows, two people who'd chosen the harder path, who'd rebuilt what greed destroyed, who'd learned that legacy isn't measured in wealth accumulated or even in homes restored, but in lives made whole, in second chances given, in the truth that it's never too late to become who you should have been. The settlement celebrated around them, Grace Springs, named by a child who'd never known the ghost town, who saw only possibility where others remembered death. And in that name, in that innocence, in that hope, redemption bloomed like desert flowers after rain.